Okay, next thing we're going to look at is two issues called reliability and validity. Basically, here's what happens. Reliability has to do with how consistent an instrument is. When we talk about instruments, we can mean a survey, we can mean tests, for example, a GRE test, an SAT, something like that. Those of you who are teachers, the PDAS is an observation that is conducted by a principal. Anything where you're measuring somebody, we assume that that two things need to happen. One, that it really measures what it's supposed to measure, and two, that it can do it all the time. I want to take the GRE as an example. If the GRE wasn't reliable, then that means that every time that you took that test, you'd get a different answer. And if that was the case, when you took that test, we wouldn't be able to use that in any kind of way if it wasn't reliable, because every time we looked at your test, we could see a different answer. That's not what we want. What we want is for you to be able to get relatively the same score every time that you take it. A couple of things can happen with this. One is you can consistently measure the wrong thing, meaning that your instrument can be very, very reliable. For example, let's take the GRE. It can be very reliable in that you could get the same score every single time that you took it. But the problem with it might be that it was no indication of how you'd really do in graduate school, which is what it's supposed to be used for. So that means that you can measure the wrong thing. Or, as I said previously, the other thing that can go wrong with instruments is that you never get the same thing twice. For example, with SAT scores, if a kid took it and one time he got a 900, the next time he got a 600, the next time he got a 1200, it's not giving us the same score, assuming everything else is the same. I have a brief example down here. Let's say that you're interested in your weight and you get on the scale and it says you weigh 140 pounds, and you come back an hour later and it says you weigh 180 pounds. Another hour later you come back and it says you weigh 100 pounds. That scale is not a reliable measure of your weight. It should not be used. Now, taking that to a broader spectrum, when you look at conducting your study, I want you to think about the problems that would be created that if your instrument that you're using to measure something wasn't reliable, that you didn't get the same answer every time you used it. That would create a tremendous amount of problems, especially if we're dealing with something very important like student performance, TAKS scores, or surveys. If every time you took a survey you gave a different answer, it's not reliable. Now, in order to establish this thing called reliability, there's lots of things that can have to happen. And what I'm going to show you, this is a document that I'm going to put in a discussion board, and there's three scenarios. There's scenario A, scenario B, scenario C. Normally I divide these up, but these three things are very important. Now I want you to understand exactly what is happening with the reliability. So when we do these quick discussions, I want everybody to respond to the same discussion board. Basically, there is several types of reliability. There is test, retest reliability, meaning that every time you give the test, you get the same answer. There is inter-rater reliability, which has to do with conducting observations, meaning that if two people are watching a group of kids and they're looking for misbehaviors, that both people see the same thing. Of course, that's not enough. They may see the same thing, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's called misbehavior. So there's a couple of issues there. One, do they agree? Two, this is the other important one, is what they are seeing really what they're talking about. I'll give you another example. I'm going to go back to these teacher evaluations. If two principals don't evaluate one teacher the same way, there is no inter-rater reliability. However, even if you can get those two principals to agree upon what they consider good teaching or poor teaching, that's not enough. that truly has to be a measure of good teaching and poor teaching. The last one, and this one I have shown right here, is the internal consistency. A lot of you will probably end up using surveys. Surveys have to have reliability also, meaning that a survey, when it's created, has lots of questions that it asks you, and it is trying to determine how you feel about something. And the reason we do that is because it's not really enough to say, do you like school? There's things about liking school in terms of belonging, and other things like that. Sorry, there's lots of things that go into liking school. There's belonging, there's a sense of purpose, there is whether or not you can do the work, whether or not the work is valuable. There's lots of things that go into this idea of liking school. So when we create surveys, we ask lots of questions, and you respond to those on a 1 to 5 scale, or a 1 to 9 scale, or 1 to 3. And what we want to know is, do all those questions have something to do with each other? Is there internal consistency between them, or do you answer different questions different ways, which means it doesn't have any reliability? There's several different ways to do this. One is called a split half correlation. And what this does is it takes a survey. Let's say the survey has 20 questions about one construct, like sense of belonging. And it takes half the questions and compares them to the other half of the questions to make sure that the way you answer one part has something to do with the other part. The second type, the Kuta-Richardson, also known as a KR20, does this same split half, but it does it over and over and over. And for example, it'll take the even questions compared to the odd questions. It'll take the first 10 questions compared to the last 10 questions. It just keeps doing it every possible way to make sure that people are consistent in the way that they answer those questions. The problem with that is only useful for dichotomous answers, meaning yes or no. The other one, and this is the most common one, is this Cronbach's alpha. And this is like the Kuta-Richardson, but it's useful for other measures like this Likert scale where you have a 1 to 5. This is the one that you're going to see the most. And it does the split half. It takes half the questions in comparison to the other half, but it does it over and over and over. It does it many, many times. I'm going to pause at this point, and then we'll go to Chapter 4, Part 2.